I'm hitting record now. And the recording materials and any other presentation items that are shown during the meeting today will be available on the icsps.illinoisstate.edu website, as well as on Illinois WorkNet within 48 hours. I will put the link to those sites in the chat box in just a few minutes. In an effort to be as accessible as possible, this webinar will be offering closed captioning, as well as the recorded session will encompass closed captioning. At the end of the webinar and on Monday, each attendee will receive a follow-up email, which will include a survey asking you about today's webinar. Please provide feedback and any suggestions you have to help us improve upcoming webinars. A reminder that if you have a faulty internet connection or would prefer to call in, you can do so by calling into this webinar using the phone number in your original registration email. And with that, I'd like to start with our first two polling questions that we do for each of our webinars. So Bethany, if you could go to the next, I think it's 2 slides in. Our first question is going to be, which partner do you represent? So you should see that poll on your screen. Okay. So it looks like we have a good Title I population here, or presence here, and then we have Title II and III, and WIOA partners and state and local workforce board members. So welcome to all. And then I'm going to share our next polling question, which asks about your local area. Okay, great. You were really fast to answer that one. So we have partners and participants from throughout the state here with a large Northern Illinois presence. So awesome. Thank you so much, everyone, and welcome. And I'd like to turn it over to our presenters.
Great. Good morning, everyone. My name is John Barr with the Illinois Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity. Thank you for your participation in this webinar this morning to share information about some fiscal management tools. Wanted to give a little bit of background on this project. The project started with a request from local area 10 over in Will County, as their program administrator was getting ready to retire and hand the reins over to a new leadership team. They identified some fiscal management needs, especially because this was around the same time that their long tenured fiscal manager also retired. Knowing how complex WIOA is, the state was happy to assist, and so we worked with, or we asked our primary technical assistance partner, Kerberek and Breckel, to assist in providing some tools and tools for fiscal management of the WIOA Title I-B program. So as we dug into the project, we quickly realized the value of sharing the information and the tools that were being developed with other local workforce area staff. So that's kind of the genesis of this. It kind of blew up from that project, and so I do also want to point out that this toolkit and this webinar is part of the state's priority for kind of continuous improvement. We know that this is an ongoing effort and an ongoing conversation. The tools that we're going to present today include a number of best practices So we wanted to include and invite both the fiscal and program staff to be aware of them. We know that many of the local workforce areas are using these types of tools, and so in some cases it may not be all new, but we hope that you can take away some new thoughts and think about how you can integrate them into your operations, especially as it relates to communicating sometimes complex fiscal information to new folks, new staff, new administrators, new board members. The bottom line here is we don't want local areas to have to recreate the wheel with some of these tools, and so we would actually invite you to provide your own tools and submit your feedback to the information that we're going to provide today. We again see this as an ongoing process to help share information that makes the system better, communicating both on the fiscal and the program management side, so we can be as effective as possible. Would also like to note that Tamika Chisholm with our office and other team members are also on the webinar today. So and thank you for joining, and we remain available for additional assistance above and beyond these tools. So definitely want to point that out. And so in closing, just want to thank KEB, LWIA 10, and all of the local area staff and others that have reviewed the information that will be presented today. And so with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Bethany Yeager with Kerberek and Breckel, or KEB as we like to shortcut it, and hand it over to dig into the presentation.
Thanks, John and Tamika. Mitch Parrish is here with me, and so is Kim Rigney. We've been on the KEB team that have had the honor of working with local workforce areas, and most recently those in the WIOA 10, to test out some of the tools that we thought might be helpful. And everything about this Fiscal Toolkit is intended to be customized to your local area. So we also were able to call on some of you who volunteered to be in what we call the fiscal focus group to kind of use these tools offline in a draft form and provide really good feedback, saying this tool might be good, but it doesn't make sense in our local area, or this tool could be fine, but our local area already has something in place that we use, or this local area is, this would be good, and especially as we prepare for any future staffing transitions, but we're going to need a little bit more time to spend with it so we can tailor it to our local area. So all those things are excellent for us to understand how this could be applied. So what today's webinar is doing is trying to show you, one, what the tools are, what their purpose is, what their practical application is, and then we'll provide some examples, some hypothetical examples, some real life examples, so that you can see, okay, how might this really help us going forward in our local area, understanding that these are just tools that we can use. They are not required. They are not currently part of a compliance check. However, they might be suggested in the future, or they might have some relationship to monitoring if some local areas are at risk of not meeting benchmarks. But right now, this is truly just a resource for you to play around with and see if it can help you and prepare your staff for any kind of training or transition. So the entire toolkit is also intended to be organic. That means it will continue to evolve and new tools could be added. And this is where your input could really be helpful. We would love to hear from you, both after today's webinar, but anytime that you are working with what tools will be most helpful to you. We want to know if you have tools that you already use that are great. Maybe there would be some benefit that if you could share them with us, we could look at them from a perspective of, well, could this be tailored to other local areas, or could this be just a good example or a best practice? And that might end up in the toolkit for others, for the benefit of others. That would be lovely. So we really want this to be an ongoing conversation. And those who have provided input, thank you so much. We continue to want your input even after today. So this slideshow also, or this slide right here, also shows some of the other specific purposes of the toolkit. Just giving you access to those best practices, as John said. Maybe there's some benefit to using some common tools as other local areas so you can compare notes or support each other in how these different variables affect each area. Really, one of the things that I've noticed just being in the workforce world for, I don't know, about 12 years now, I suppose, is that the ability to strengthen communication between fiscal and program units is anything we can do to support that is valuable. Orienting new team members, we mentioned. Also, this is another one that comes up under the topic of when you're preparing for any kind of staffing transition. A lot of times if you inherit tools that others have used before you, sometimes you just keep using them just because you're trying to learn on the job and train yourself and what, where you have to get this data, what you have to report, where you put it, where you save it, how you communicate it. All those things are good, but sometimes it's really helpful to kind of break yourself away from the we've always done it this way to, oh, maybe there's a way that we could really shave away some of this information and filter out what we don't need and focus on what we do. It just might help you prioritize your energy a little bit better. And as John said, don't recreate the wheel. I think we're all famous for attempting to do that. We don't need to. Let's not waste our energy. And then anything to help you and us improve the tracking of quality data is what we're really going for here. So this toolkit is really right now in its current form, a bunch of separate documents. Some are Word documents, some are Excel spreadsheets. All of them are editable by you. And it's so in combination, that's what we call the toolkit. They are considered templates that you can pull from the WorkNet site where they are saved or they will be saved and work with them and save them on your local systems and revise them however you see fit. The website, which we will put on the slide or in the chat box, is at illinoisworknet.com and then /GATA, G-A-T-A. That's where some other resources are already saved. And so we will make sure that once this fiscal toolkit is ready to be posted online with your input, then it will always be there and continue to be updated in that same place. So other keywords on this slide that I'm showing are 1, customizable templates. 2, increase institutional knowledge so that you all have an understanding both within your own teams on program and fiscal sides, but also maybe even among each other. Clarity of procedures. Sometimes I think practices are routine, but maybe not formalized. Or maybe they've just always been that way, but they're not really written down anywhere. So that does challenge institutional knowledge. We want to make sure that the clarity of procedures are a resource for any staff, no matter who's serving in each position at any given time. And the last dot point is user-friendly. There's no sense in making a very complicated tool that doesn't do you any good. So whatever we do, we want to make sure that it's truly working for you and that it's intuitive about how to use it. Excuse me, I scrolled too fast. The first tool, so we'll go through all the tools in the toolkit as of today. First telling you just the general purpose and practical application of them. Then we'll share our screens and show you the actual tools in real life. And Mitch will provide and Kim will provide some real life examples or some hypothetical examples of how they might be useful to you. The first tool is just a series of flowcharts. And the purpose is to show how to translate routine program expenses into the local accounting system so that, again, you don't have to recreate the wheel. So the practical application is to map how you get from your accounts to GRS reporting codes and realizing those monthly expenses, the accruals if you use those, reporting expenses and accruals, and then finally realizing those obligations. So through all those steps, how does it relate? So this is what this is just a screenshot. This is not the actual tool. And then we don't expect you to be able to read that on the screen today, but just so you know what the overall structure of this flow chart is, that this first page is a overview of the process, and it's color coded by each step of the process. So then as you go through the actual toolkit, the colors will each have their own page, and that's where you can break them down into more detail. And this is intended for you to tailor. All the steps that are in there right now, consider placeholders. If you are accessing the tool later, get in there, look at the steps, make sure that the people and the steps make sense, and then modify it if it's not. So make it work for you. That's the intent. The only other thing I would mention is that the Dceo policies and any kind of guidance that exists related to each step are cited in the document, so that if you're wondering why this step is here or what's the source of that, hopefully the definition right there on the page will be able to help you. So I'm going to share my screen to show you the actual tool, and then Mitch, do you have a real life example of how this might apply? Excuse me, I've got to move this box, excuse me.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Bethany. So what I am going to do, I'm going to take the people on the call here through a couple scenarios, one for each one of the toolkits. And I'm not a writer by any means, but we just came up with WIOA 30, since at this point they do not exist. So one way that you can utilize this tool, I'll just go through the scenario here, is WIOA 30's fiscal manager has always mapped accounts and ensured that their accounting software data and GRS aligned. This person is soon to be retired, and most of their processes are not written down and they're just completed by memory. Like Bethany said earlier, just doing something because it's always been done that way. However, a new staffer is soon to fill that person's role. So the fiscal manager on the verge of retirement can customize this flow chart, adding the necessary amount of detail to each step so that they can give the new staffer a roadmap on how to achieve mapping, realization of monthly expenses, accruals, reporting, and realization of obligations. So when they were going through this process and customizing the flow chart, they realized that the current month accounting expenses did not equal the total of the GRS reporting lines. Thus, they went back to the key that they had created during the mapping of accounts process to ensure that all the GRS reporting lines were accurately accounted for. When they did this, they found that several accounts had changed in their accounting software and no longer matched those in GRS. So this flowchart process made the identification and remedy of this issue simple, straightforward, and now they have a tool for the new staffer to proceed with these processes in the future.
Thanks, Mitch. Kim, would you have any other ideas or insights to add?
I think Mitch did a great job. We just wanted to make sure that the areas knew that there were different steps to the fiscal flowchart and reporting, and that some may or may not use every step. And so, like you said, the customizable to remove parts of it, or maybe you need more information in there. All of those squares can be updated to your own language, your own accounting system words and verbiage that you're accustomed to, that may or may not be the same thing that is in this template.
Thanks, Kim. So throughout this webinar, we also thought, well, this is an opportunity to pick your brains. So there are some discussion questions on the slide. And you are welcome to type in the chat box your responses, and we'll save those and for future consideration about how they might be able to help us improve the toolkit going forward. So one is, does your local area even have flowcharts already established for fiscal processes like these, or maybe others that you think would be helpful to add? if so, what ideas do you have that would allow us to think of other procedures to add in a flowchart format? Another question, as you might be considering typing, is how likely is your local workforce area going to adapt these and maybe use the flowchart for your own purposes? And then the last question that we're always interested in, especially again, if you're going to type in the chat, is what other processes would you want to add for your local area that could help your staff be trained or transitioned?
So Bethany, while there, if you wanted to share your screen of the flowcharts that are a little larger, like you showed the overview, but maybe the next page where it just breaks down one or two of the, yeah, so people can see that it's not always tiny, and it really does correspond to the overview, which was helpful for new staff, that there's an overview, but then the smaller steps also.
Thanks, Kim. So as she said, so each color coding, as I mentioned, has its own page, and this is where we would encourage you to tailor it so that you put the right people. For example, is the fiscal officer really the one who's going to do this step? And these are just placeholders based on existing examples that we've been working with. And then the timing, tailor that to say how annual, is this an annual function or not? Weekly, quarterly. So the first one is just mapping the accounts to the GRS reporting. The second one is realization of monthly expenses, and then it describes what the definition of expenses is. Then the next one is realization of accruals, if you use those. And again, accruals is defined with a citation if you want to figure out how that applies to your local area. And the last one, again, for customizing is just reporting expenses and accruals. Oops, there might be one more. I'm sorry, realization of obligations is the last one. And again, it defines obligations at the top of the page, and then it defines what we mean by unexpended balances. So what we'll do is continue. The last thing I would mention about these discussion questions is, even if we don't talk about them together today, we do think that, with this PowerPoint in the future, you might have some of these conversations with your own teams, both program and fiscal, to say, do we want to have this? If we're not using it now, should we? And refer back to this PowerPoint and webinar to say, what local conversation do we want to have about building our own local version of the toolkit? So we'll move on to the next tool. This is the budget framework. So in thinking about budgeting, our experiences and recent conversations with local areas has been that sometimes the budgeting process is not as formal as other procedures, or sometimes roles are unclear, and timing is always a little bit of different in every local area. There's a lot of variables, in other words, that go into developing a budget, maintaining a budget, and then modifying a budget throughout the program year. So what this tool is trying to do is to say, here's a framework. Consider the timing, the who, and the what throughout those three steps: the development, maintenance, and modification of your budget. And again, this is going to be different in every local area, but the intent is to start the conversation about those variables and about the process to make sure it's clear. And this is a Word document that describes in narrative form what to consider at each step. And the only other point is that the budget framework should not be a one-time thing. It's intended to be updated every single year, because you know what? We all know variables change every single year. People change, external factors change about timing. So this is intended to be a tool to support you at the very beginning of when you're starting to talk about your budgets for the next program year, and continue to talk about it and help it guide what you should be talking about and where your energy should be at each quarter of the program year. So again, I will share my screen. Actually, I'll just show you a screenshot of it first. And then after I go through a couple screenshots, then Mitch is going to give us another example of how it was actually used or could be used going forward. So this is a screenshot of the first section of the framework, and it's focused on budget development. So this is typically, you know, when you're starting to think about the next program year, there's always a question of, well, when do we actually start the conversation? And in working with local areas in the recent past, you know, this is just an example of the timing. Again, you would tailor this to your local area, but this is suggesting as a starting point for your conversations, maybe you should talk as early as March and say, who is really going to set this budget development process, the timeline, and who's going to clarify those roles and tell everybody else about how it's going to work this year. And what this is suggesting here at the top is in early March, the director or whomever is in that position that should be leading this process would talk through the dates, the target dates of when things need to be reviewed or when input is needed, what meetings are going to establish the benchmark of when you need to have certain material ready for review, and then who ultimately has the authority. Is it a local government unit? Is it a workforce board? Is it just staff? Or what is the right level of involvement of each of those entities? That's where we talk about role clarity. So this is saying start in early March and have those things in place, and then communicate them out, because maybe they're not as obvious as they should be. The other thing to note here is that throughout this document, again, this is a Word document, when you look at the actual tool in a Word document, those boxes, the dot points, they are not in sequential order. They are just kind of almost like a checklist format of, hey, did we cover our base here? Hey, did we close the loop on this detail? Just things to remind you of maybe what to address in your conversations as you're going through this early budget development process. And even questions about, you know, how involved should the local workforce be? Local workforce board be? Do they need, you know, at what point do we engage them around budget development or approval? Just getting that clarity. Maybe it's been in practice for a long time, but again, maybe it's good to refresh all the staff, especially if there are new people, about how that works, or new board members and how that works. Another page of the budget framework relates to the budget maintenance period. So once you have a budget in place, then how do you start to maintain it in a way that it's useful to you, and maybe even supporting your tracking of budget to actual. So this is another screenshot, and it can help you look at where your energy and questions and discussion should be by quarter. So the example on the screen is in the third quarter. Where should your energy be on tracking your obligations and expenditures? How do you know when to raise the red flags to the administrators if things are not on track, or if you're at risk of not meeting some benchmarks? And then, you know, if you follow the flow of this document, it can also help you ask, well, what input should we be getting from program managers and fiscal managers in recommending actions if we need to get back on track to meeting our benchmarks? So again, it's just trying to plant a bunch of seeds for your local discussion about how you want to move forward with your budget and your maintenance. The last example I'll give you of what the screenshot on the budget framework relates to when things need to change. Things are not happening as you thought in the original budget. You need to either modify the budget, or you need to start deobligating certain you know, program expenses and obligations in order to shift energy and shift money to meet those benchmarks. So If major changes are needed, and let's just think about who should have input in the decision of deobligating or making that major budget modification, who should be informed, who has the ultimate authority to make that decision, and what process and timing do they have to make that decision, and then who implements the decision. So by going through this checklist format, you can start to make those decisions that, again, just add clarity to everyone involved. And hopefully, if you do get in that position, you would have that conversation beforehand so that you don't have to figure that out on the spot. You already have a process in place for if that were to happen. Mitch, do you have another example that you could give us, a hypothetical of that WIOA 30?
Yes. So back with the WIOA 30 scenario, they have been having trouble meeting Dceo benchmarks for the adult funding stream because there is a disconnect between fiscal staff and program managers. So much so that last year they were unable to obligate that 80% and ended up having to return some funding. So the WIOA utilized the budget framework to ensure that the institutional knowledge of the fiscal manager was captured prior to their retirement, as I said previously. Specifically, the fiscal manager that was retiring and the new staffer utilized the budget development section to plan for the upcoming project year. Through this process, the fiscal manager and new staffer were able to map out who is the lead person for each task, project, and report. Once it had been completed, they shared the budget framework with all staff that had fiscal responsibilities in the center to ensure everyone was on the same page. This process will definitely help ensure that the fiscal and program staff have a clear plan for the upcoming program year and understand who is responsible for each activity.
Thanks, Mitch. So these are the discussion questions we encourage you. Again, if you would like to insert anything in the chat, go ahead. Otherwise, we encourage you to take these questions back to your local areas and talk about, do you have a routine budget process in place? Is it documented? Is it consistent? Or is it all over the place? And if you have a really good process you use, can you share that with us? Again, for us to consider what might be helpful to other local areas. Another thing to consider and what we would love your input about, or that you should talk about locally, is what other budget related activities might be helpful to add to the framework. You know, we talked about budget development, maintenance, and deobligations, but are there other activities that you think should be reflected in there that would help build institutional knowledge? And then the last one, we just want to know, is this going to be practical for you? Are you going to use it? Are you going to try it out to see if your staff can be helpful in developing a process that can be more standard going forward? So we'll move on to the next tool. This relates to a budget scenario, a scenario budget, excuse me, I said it backwards. Now, the use of this is when you're starting to think about your budget, or at any time you need to make a major change. How can you start to think through the implications of some of the variables that can happen during the year? You know, what if income comes in far more than you expected, or far less than you expected? What happens if your expenses are far more or far less? Or what happens if carry-in funding is different than you thought, or you really need to look at how you're addressing your carry-in funding? What the scenario budget is trying to do is say, okay, you have your budget, but let's play around with those variables to see what the implications are on both the bottom line of the fiscal, but also on maybe program implications, maybe even staffing. What is some of these changes that might occur? How would that affect our staffing capacities that we need in order to carry out some of these activities that would be needed to do to meet our benchmarks? So this is a tool that you get to play around to say, what if? So this is a screenshot. I'll explain it first, and then we will show the actual tool here in a second. But this is a screenshot of one of the tabs this is an Excel spreadsheet. And the workbook contains several scenarios that you can play around with So there's a series of scenarios for income, and then there's a series of scenarios for expenses. And then also eventually if you want to use it for specific to carry in. But the first thing to do is decide what types of scenarios do you want to play around with and forecast out. So one example is to look at different revenue streams and what happens if things change in that revenue stream. So I'm going to share the toolkit, the actual tool first, and Mitch will walk us through again that hypothetical example, and then Kim is going to help us tell you a little bit more about the functionality of the actual Excel spreadsheet. So Mitch, you want to describe your tool first, or your example first?
Yeah, so the scenario would be because LWIA 30, and this is playing off the previous examples as well. So because LWIA 30 has been having trouble reaching that 80% benchmark, they can utilize the budget scenario workbook to help them plan for the next project year. With the scenario budget, LWIA 30 used the new PY income scenarios tab to plan. Since they can accurately input PY 2020 incomes for each of the programs, including administration, they stand a better chance of meeting their benchmarks next year. They know that they're going to have to fill a couple positions. They know that some staff will receive raises, and they know that more hours will be worked with the absences of COVID-19. Thus, they chose to plan on a scenario of exact incomes from PY 2020, or being 100% as one scenario, 105% increase as the second scenario, taking into account raises, and then also 150% increase taking into account the new staff and raises. So obviously these are hypothetical, but those were the three scenarios that they chose. So this table makes it easy for them to plug in data in the scenario percentages. Lastly, they're then able to see the total income that they should plan for based on the three scenarios. Keep in mind, a local area can utilize a combination of the scenarios on the summaries tab to show multiple factors affecting their budgeting decisions. For instance, as you can see on the new PY summaries tab, WIOA 30 also used the new PY expenses scenario tab. Then on rows 3 and 5, they are able to input which scenarios they want to match up to see the total effect that would be. So you can mix and match different scenarios so that it'll play out those scenarios overall. So you could utilize, the two different scenarios, and then obviously see what the effect is.
Thanks, Mitch. So the first thing I'll mention is that there is an instructions tab, so that if you want to read how to use this, when to use this, and what the color coding means, what is a manual input versus what is an automatic calculation, this instructions tab should explain that for you. And the only thing I would note there is that this spreadsheet was based on a tool out there for nonprofits. And basically, Kim and the team helped tailor this to what we thought might be helpful to local workforce areas. So it is based on something that's actually been used, and hopefully that we can apply it to the local workforce area that you're in. Kim, would you like to talk a little bit more about the functionality of these tabs and tell me, some of the variables that we can test out?
Sure. So the dark green tabs, the new program year, income, expense, and then summaries. The first tab is for the income, and so what you might or might not get as a funding. And so what we hear a lot is we don't know how much money we're going to get in the upcoming year. And so people have entered in column C the prior year actual allocation. And then, based on their spending and whatever they've heard in columns D, you could increase or decrease that funding. So you could say we're going to get the exact same, or maybe we're only going to get 80% of it, and you could leave D there, and then, so you can mix and match those. And so some of the areas have said, we have no idea. And so they just wanted to be able to say, if I get 80% or if I get 120%, what are we going to do? What does that look like? And so this was a way to get the range included in there. The other thing that could happen is they said some people don't want to do all this extra work and do all these extra, and that's fine. But sometimes maybe your youth program or your adult program would just use their section. So it doesn't have to be used. If you scroll down, Bethany, it has a section for each funding stream, and it could be used overall for the whole grant, or it could be used just for the adult and dislocated, however you want to use it. And again, it's up to you. And so in the blue, the light blue, that's where you put in actual numbers. And then at the very top, you can change it by percentage for income. So that's the income side. The next tab has the expense side.
Can I note one other thing? That these right here, row 7, this tells you this is scenario 1 for income, this is scenario 2 for income, and this is scenario 3 for income, because that affects the functionality of the summary tab that we'll get to.
Yeah.
Now this is the expense tab.
Yep. So then on the expense side, a lot more variables come into play. And so they entered again in column C, prior year allocations. And for this example, we just put something in each funding stream. You can go down to line item details and put something in each one of those rows, right? And it works the same. It's there for you. But for the example, we wanted to kind of keep it simple. So then in column D, some people adjusted their budgets. And so you can put actual numbers in there. So that's your baseline. And then from there, the increase or decrease in F, you can add some more for this year. Like Mitch said, hey, we know we're going to have more salaries and fringes. And so we're going to just increase for that position or increase for the extra hours. And then the same thing in column H. So you can run 3 different, like if we fill 2 positions, or if we only fill 1 position, or if, for youth or adult, you get more programs, like you brought on a college and so now you're going to spend more, you could add additional expenses. So like it could be another $10,000 there or whatever. Or if you knew that, hey, in youth, we had $2,000 of expenses last year, but this year we've lost that contract. That college is no longer working with us. You could also decrease it. So however you wanted to use that. And again, you can use it by funding stream or by exact GRS line item. It's up to you. And those have the same thing at the top. You have a scenario 1, 2, and 3. And then those flow through to that third summary tab where you can pick your income scenarios, and you can use income scenario 1 for all 3 of these, and then just change the expenses. And so the expenses make a change. Or you could say, you know what, I think we really are going to get 120%. So we might use the income scenario for 2 or 3, and then just change the expenses. So it's completely up to you. Every time you change something in row 3 or 5, it totals everything for you in a quick snapshot so you can kind of see what's going on. And then at the very bottom, like Bethany said, you can, the area can say this impact is this on the program. We might need this for organizational changes, and this is what we expect. And you can say, we highly think that scenario 1 is going to happen, but there's a small chance that scenario 2 overall could happen. And so it's just a tool, and it's not meant to cause extra work, but it's meant to see quickly what would happen if funding changed on either the income side or the expense side. And remember, the chat box is there if you have any questions. And Bethany, I think that's all I've got. I mean, there is
Thanks,
that
Kim.
green for carry-in. Sometimes people wanted to make sure for the carry-in income and expenses that they got that all spent down early. So we just put another set of tabs there. It works the same, but if you wanted to split it. We also taught that,
Thank you.
yeah, I'm sorry, I really said I was done. But you could copy this as many times as you want for whoever wants it. Overall, one funding stream, one program can be used however you want to. Now I'm really done.
That's okay, Kim. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah. So yeah, I think the part that resonates the most is that this is not a required tool, and it may feel like extra work, but it also could be there if you find yourself really needing to be prepared for things that could change, and then thinking through, well, what does that mean for our staffing? What does that mean for how many vendor contracts we might need to look at, or renewals? It can be applied in a very practical way if you think that you need to test out those variables. So, okay. So that is that tool spreadsheet, that spreadsheet tool. So the questions we encourage you to think about, either online today or offline with your own teams, is, are you going to test out different scenarios? Could it be helpful to you and your team? What variables are you constantly having to think about every year when you are developing your budget, or when you think you need to make a modification? Could this be a good tool to help you out do that? And will you actually play around with it? So that's what we want to know. I'm pausing to check out the chat box just to see if there's anything we could answer online. If there's anything we can't answer online today, then we can always follow up with an FAQ after. Or if there's something specific to an LWIA, then we can follow up with you there too.
So Bethany, one of the questions was, should information on meeting a training minimum be included? And that was from Julie. And I mentioned that we do have an upcoming tool for benchmarks, and she just wants to make sure that that training minimum benchmark is included. And so I think we're up to date on the chats, and we'll cover that. And Julie will make sure that we check with you to make sure that what we have answers your question.
Thanks, Kim. Appreciate that. All right, the next tool is participant average cost. So this is a very simple spreadsheet. And we know many of you might have your own tools for how you think about, how do we find out the average cost per participant in our local area? Great. Keep using those tools if they work for you. What this is doing is saying, if there's a very simple way to translate what the cost is to how that average cost participant might affect the number of participants we need to serve to meet benchmarks, or to spend down our full budget. This is a very simple tool that could be used. So it's just looking at the average cost across all funding streams, and for an individual funding stream. So it could be used for either, similar to the scenario budget. So one consideration that we can keep giving is how we deal with carry-in participants. So we haven't figured that out yet. We welcome more input on that, but let's show you the tool first, and then we'll pause to see if you have any input on that. This is just a screenshot of it. I can show the actual tool in a second. I think I covered everything. I'll pause there. Mitch, why don't you give your example, and then we can show the actual spreadsheet and how it functions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will mention that this is a pretty spreadsheet, nicely color coded as well. And so we'll go back with the LWIA 30. And as I said earlier, they were having some difficulty meeting that Dceo obligation benchmark. So they knew that they had $50,000 to spend towards the end of the program in order to get to that 80,000 or 80% benchmark, but they were unsure of what it would take to get there. So with this participant average cost tool, it makes it simple for LWIA 30 to input their per participant costs. So once those are included, the tool does the work for you, and it'll divide the remaining budget by the average participant cost to give LWIA 30 a close estimate of how many more participants they must serve before they meet that 80% benchmark. If LWIA 30 was unable to determine the current year expenses per participant at any given time, they could actually utilize previous program year data on the right-hand side to determine an estimate number of participants needed. As you can see in this example, the number of participants needed for both of these scenarios is very close, from 40 to 38. So it gives them a very good estimate of what they need, when they need, in order to get to that 80% benchmark.
Thanks, Mitch. Kim, is there any other insight you would have about the utility of this spreadsheet or the functionality of it?
Sure. I think the other thing we got from our focus group was sometimes different programs have different rates. And so this could be used overall, but then you could look at college A might have tuition costs of $2,000 and program C might be a whole different program and it could have $3,000 program costs. So you could use it to say, I'm going to have 5 people go to college A, 10 people go to college B. How does that look? And what does that spending come down to? We heard from some of them that this is so simple, and yes, we have all of that. And we had other areas that this was eye-opening, that they've really struggled for a lot of years on, hey, what does $50,000 mean in real life? And how does that translate to, I need to find 40 people to go through a class. And so again, like Bethany said, if you have it and you've already got this, great. But if this is helpful to be able to identify where to start putting effort and how much effort is needed, that's great. The other thing is, if we're serving 40 participants, how much staff do we need? So it doesn't go further to that point, but it can provide insight for that.
Thanks, Kim.
Yep.
So back to our questions here that we think that you could ask yourselves locally is, do you have a process in place for doing this type of calculation, as simple as it is? Or do you think that this would be a useful tool? And what do you want to do about those variables? Maybe should any additional variables be added? As Kim said, there are many that you could use this tool for, but how many do you want to build into the actual tool? Okay, there's a couple others, and Julie, this might be what might answer your question here. And if not, just let us know. Excuse me, I'm going to clear my throat. Excuse me. So we call this the Dceo benchmark cheat sheet. And what we're really trying to do is take the guessing game out of the formula that's used to calculate the fund utilization report every month that Dceo sends out, and hopefully allow you to compare how you are calculating your total funds available versus how it might be calculated in the fund utilization report. So let's just put the formula out there and allow for you to compare it to your own local versions and your local calculations. So there's one value in having that formula right in front of you in the spreadsheet that we'll show you. There's another value of allowing you to do your own checking and tracking of how are you in meeting those Dceo benchmarks every month or quarter. So that's the utility of it. First, Mitch, I'm sorry, would you like to explain a little bit more, a little bit more about the use of the spreadsheet and that you helped develop?
Yes, absolutely. So just like Bethany said, this can be a very useful tool, whether, you just wanted to know the ins and outs of the FUR, the fund utilization report, or whether you're actually going to make it a practical tool in your local workforce. So this screenshot that Bethany's showing is one page on the tool of the Dceo FUR calculation tab, which actually includes a breakdown of each one of the calculations that creates that fund utilization report that Dceo refers to in determining if a local area is on pace to meet benchmarks. So this offers, local workforce area background knowledge of how that FUR report is developed. So again, this is just kind of background, but it puts a good picture to what the fund utilization is actually made up of. So the next slide is going to build off of those calculations, and you can tell that it's all color coordinated. So each one of these screenshots are going to be color coordinated and it'll flow to the next one. Once we actually get into the tool, it is a pretty large tool. Don't let it scare you. It just has a lot of information all at once, but it's all color coordinated to hopefully, you know, ease that burden and make it a little bit more simple. But this screenshot is the next section of that FIR calculation tab, which we'll look at here in a minute. The top table actually shows an example of a recent FIR report of each one of the funding streams and how each calculation shown in the previous slide is utilized for that DCEO review process. So this representation of costs that have occurred, I believe it was as of March, showing that the adult funding stream is not on pace to meet the benchmark as of the month and projections. So it's shown in red. If you've ever been in a situation where your FIR report showed up red for that percentage of TFA, that shows you that you're not on pace. The bottom table on this screenshot is can be used by local areas to insert carry-in funds, your allotments, transfers, expenditures, to determine the percentage of total funds available expended at any given time throughout the program year. So OEAs can manually enter that data into those blue cells, and we always try to include a key to show you, whether it's a manual entry cell or if it's got formula. And the gray cells we did lock them. And just so you know, on each one of these tools instructions page, if there is a locked cell and there's formula in it, we included the password to unprotect the worksheet. So just know that that's out there if you actually needed for some reason to change a formula, or if you wanted to look at the formula, you could do so. So the percentage of total funds available expended percentages may be compared with the DCEO benchmarks on the benchmark progress tab. So the next slide, and again, these are just screenshots. We'll take a look at the tool. This is table 1 on the next tab of the tool. And this reflects DCEO benchmarks for a program year as if all obligations and accruals became actual expenses on a monthly basis. Basically, it was perfectly distributed throughout the year and divided by 12, which we know is, definitely not the case in probably any one of the local workforce areas across the state. So this can just be used for planning purposes and reference. And again, this is just, in a perfect scenario, all of the benchmarks divided by 12 for each one of the months in the program year. And the next slide will be the bottom portion of the tool. It's the last tab of the DCEO benchmark cheat sheet. And it's the adjusted targets in DCEO benchmark table 2 basically allow local workforce area to alter the timing of when accruals and expenses are anticipated. So for example, obligations might not become actual expenses until October or January, which may be more in line with tuition payments. So as you can see, you can't see the rows here, but we'll look in the tool here in a minute. Rows 26 and 27 in the tool, you can enter in column C the specific month in which actual expenses are anticipated to increase or decrease, and by what percent. And that's in column D, as we'll see in the tool. And again, the gray box are auto-calculated. So once you put in the data, the months and the percentages, it'll pre-populate the percentages for you. So that's the tool, Bethany. I don't know if you want me to share a scenario with them as well as we walk through the actual tool.
Yeah, that would be great. And I apologize to everyone. I accidentally click things sometimes and it advances a slide. There's just so many buttons open on my computer, so I do apologize for that. But there is, again, this is the actual tool, the spreadsheet. There's an instructions tab and explaining what each tab does and what each section and table does. So just know that that's a resource. And then there's also very helpful definitions of how things are defined for expenditures, accruals, obligations, unexpended balances, total funds available. So maybe even just the definition, having it in the same spot, and could be helpful for your staff and for us. I mean, I will continue to look back at this tab just to remember exactly how things are defined. So that's a resource for you. Then we get to the actual tools that you can plug data into. And Mitch, if you want to take it from here, explaining your example, I can demonstrate.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, back with the LWIA 30, as we have said previously, they've been having trouble tracking their adult expenses and the progress made towards that Dceo 80% benchmark. They just received a fund utilization report from Dceo showing that they were underspent in the adult program based on the status of their total expenditures. As you can see on this report, and some of you may be aware, when you are underspent in any program according to Dceo, the percent of total funds available expended will show up in red. So LWIA 30 here was tired of seeing their account in red, so they utilized this table below to start tracking their expenses on a monthly basis. However, what they soon realized was that their expenses for the adult program were likely going to show up in red for the majority of the program year, because the expenses and accruals are heavily weighted in January when the majority of their tuition is due. In this situation, LWIA 30 can utilize that table 2 on the next page, to transfer or change their percentages when they're going to receive those fundings, to update this benchmark progress tab to show or include in their response to Dceo that they do plan to reach the 80% benchmark, but the progress toward it may not be actually seen or realized until possibly after January. So this is just a good tool to be able to support your progress and your position with your program at any given time.
Apologize again for changing the view. Yeah, it actually, Mitch, the example is perfect because it can say, this can be a communications tool for your local area in Dceo to say, where are we really? Okay, this is what it looks like at this quarter, at this time, given these calculations, but what in reality do we expect? Are we okay or not? So this could support you in kind of assessing that in partnership with Dceo. The other thing I wanted to show you is we mentioned the password. We were asked to lock the tabs that auto-calculate so that people who try to use them didn't accidentally screw them up, which we all happen to do sometimes. So because they're password protected, as Mitch said, the password is right there for you in the instructions tab of every spreadsheet that we've gone over today, so that if you do want to open those cells up, then you have the password to do that. But they are locked to begin with so that, again, we don't have inadvertent mistakes in screwing up the formulas. Okay, just curious if anyone else, okay, Courtney, I saw in the chat that this was what you're looking for. Excellent. Kim, thanks for keeping that up in the chat. I appreciate that. Anything else to add before we go on to the next tool? All right. Then there are some discussion questions for you on the slide. And then again, we encourage you to use these later on in your own offices or remote environments. Do you fully understand the FIR? It's question number 1. The second one is, does this help bring clarity to you, to the even just having the formula and the definitions in front of you and your staff? Will you use this tool to test out how you're doing in your benchmarks in any given month or quarter? And then think through at what time of year do you have the highest expenditures, and how does that reflect in the FIR each month or quarter? And then do you have any other information that should be added to the FIR? Oh, I'm sorry, to the Dceo cheat sheet. All right, then this is the last, second to last, but the last one's very brief. This one is a dashboard for the local workforce board. We know that every local workforce board is different, especially you know, if you're in a county or if you're in a different type of organization. What does your local workforce board need to know on a regular basis, whether that's monthly or quarterly or annually. What is the right level of detail to share with the board how you're doing in meeting Dceo benchmarks and overall? So what this was inspired by a local workforce area that already had something similar. And what we did is work with that dashboard and tried to make it so that it was a useful tool where the fiscal managers could plug in data from their own work papers, drop it into this tool that we'll show you, and then it automatically populates the graphs that then print out on one page or can be shared as a PDF on one page. So hopefully it's a good balance between the data entry that the fiscal managers can do and the auto population of a one-page dashboard that might be the right level of detail for your workforce board. Although we know that it differs about the level of detail that is most appropriate for your board. So that's just something to think about. This is a screenshot of the first half, the top of the dashboard. And when we show you, we'll show you that in total, it can be printed on one page. But this allows you to look at real-time data for your budget amounts, your expenses, your obligations, accruals, and how does that look graphically to your board at that high level. We'll show you how that auto-populates in just a minute. This is the bottom half of the one-page dashboard for the board. So it shows you by benchmark, what does it look like for obligations, expenses, how does that break down by program for adult, dislocated worker, and youth? What does the direct training look like over sometimes that 2-year period of how the funds can be used for direct training and calculated for direct training, and then the youth work-based learning. So that's just the overall. And Kim, I'm going to show this is what the dashboard looks like if you were to go print that from the spreadsheet. This is what they would see. So it's all on one page with the keys about what each color means. Okay, so now I'm going to end the print view and go to the actual dashboard. So this is what it looks like in the Excel spreadsheet. This is the dashboard that prints on one page. Now notice, again, there's an instructions tab with a password if you want to unprotect those cells for changing it, and the explanation of how you use it. This is the dashboard tab that prints on one page, and this is the data entry tab that I'm going to scroll up. And this is where Kim comes in. Kim, would you be able to describe a little bit more about this utility and how it could be used?
Sure. So our fiscal people, and that's kind of my background, is putting all the numbers and all the spreadsheets. So I'm not a program person. So this spreadsheet, we have all got our own worksheets, and this one was developed maybe to match a specific WIOA. And so it could be tailored, in format so that you could just copy whatever work paper you're using and then just drop it into column C, E, G, or I so that you don't have to manually key anything else. So it's basically all your expenses, all your accruals, all your obligations by GRS line. And in the blue, it's all there just to drag and drop. We did have some areas in the focus group ask us to put the totals in. So like the total admin's now in gray in column C, and that could be changed or left if maybe you don't have a worksheet that matches this format and you don't want to change this format. So you're just going to type in those first 3 numbers. It alleviates the need to add one more key to the total admin. But we left it in columns E, G, and I so that people would realize that it could work either way, drag and drop or manually key, whatever is best for you. And again, these are all sample numbers. So the numbers are tiny, but in thousands just makes it easier for those high level people to see numbers that they can kind of understand. And you wouldn't have to use the in thousands. Again, it's completely up to you. And so that just walks down the GRS lines. So you can scroll down, Bethany. In column M, we needed to add the second year for one of the benchmarks that was a 2-year item. And I don't remember which benchmark it was, maybe work-based learning or direct, I don't remember.
Direct training. Yeah, it was direct
Okay.
training.
Okay, so it needed a 2-year calculation. So just for that adult and dislocated worker, you drop in those items also. All of the charts are just an example of what's going to flow to the front, so that if you needed to change something, you could change the chart here and then copy it to the front dashboard. But I don't like to flip tabs when I'm trying to get a chart to work, so they're all right there. And then a little further down, I think the calculations, yeah, it's just try to give a little bit more direction there, that you could see how it was calculated and what's going into those things. And again, fiscal people will understand this, but the high level people just want to see the dashboard. So this is the behind the scenes workshop work paper to make those charts work. And if it scares you, it's probably not for you. It's for an audience to do the data entry side. And then the dashboard is just for you. So we tried to make sure on the dashboard, in case they didn't know, it had all the directions. It tells what benchmark they're trying to get to and why. So is there anything else, Bethany or Mitch? I know Mitch had a lot of play in this too.
Oh, excuse me, I'm going back to, clicking just gets me in trouble. I do apologize. Yeah, Mitch, is there any other scenario that you would like to highlight here?
Yeah, sure. So we can go back to WIOA 30. You know, they've been presenting figures to the local workforce board each quarter, but the data presented is always too detailed, and the board, you know, doesn't always want or need to be in the weeds of the data. So with this tool, WIOA 30 can input that data from GRS on the data entry tab. And once all that data has been filled out, the report will generate those easy to follow charts and graphs with high level pictures of all the detail that the fiscal personnel has been trying to present all along. So the data that WIOA 30 plugged into the tool was as of March. And we can see on the dashboard, back to the dashboard page, that the obligations, accruals, and expense breakdown shows that their progress is lacking if they are to meet that 80% benchmark by the end of June. So this tool can be utilized throughout the year and in conjunction with any one of the other tools. So for instance, they may want to revert back to the average participant cost tool in order to calculate and figure out how many participants they need to serve to be on track with the benchmarks. And then, you know, potentially their next board meeting, they'd be able to show that they're making that progress towards the benchmark, and have, you know, some better news to share with the board and make it easily presentable. As you can see here on this single page printout, you can print it out, give it to each board member, and be able to present it in an easy to read format.
Thanks, Mitch and Kim. Going back to our presentation here to finish up here, the questions that we say are, one is, what is your experience in reporting to the workforce board and the right level of detail to present? That's a conversation that you should have. If I know you already have it, but encourage you to continue. Will it be helpful for you if you transition to using a dashboard like this, where you enter data and detail on one tab, it automatically generates the report on the other, so that the board doesn't have to see the detail if they don't want it, but it's there if you need to draw on it to answer any questions about the graphs. And then, does additional information need to be added to the dashboard? This is our last tool, and this is it. There's no other separate document other than a Word document. And this is simply to say, you know, what do you need to have handy in order to support your GRS monthly reports? Kim, do you want to explain a little bit more about where this came from and how you think it would be helpful to use?
Sure. So we are asked to help all kinds of people and roles, and we ask for, what are your GRS work papers? And we usually get between 2 and 6 documents, and then we work through it with who touches them and who prepares them. And inevitably we'll get to something and they'll be like, oh, that comes from such and such, which we weren't sent. And that's fine. We just ask for a little bit more. And what happens is so many people touch the amount of documents needed to prepare a monthly GRS reporting that the recommendation is to put a file out there that has everything in it used for that month. And so some areas have this hard copy, and that's fine. And other areas would use it as an electronic copy, and that's fine too. It doesn't make any difference how your processes work, but that you would compile all of your documents in an easy to find location, so that if, tech support came in, if GRS had a question, if auditors came in, it's just easy. And the other thing is, we've had a lot of turnover, and we talk about a lot of people trying to retire. And this way, as those successors come through and they're looking for something and they say, I don't have any idea where this data came from, at least they would have a starting point. And so by putting that all in one folder, and it can still be kept in the other locations, and program managers can have their copy. And this is kind of a redundancy, but storage is pretty cheap nowadays. It's not like you're going to overflow. So we just suggested that any reports that are ran from the financial software would be included in that, your financial reports. And then spreadsheets from the program managers or the contractors that would affect those reports or are used to populate any reports, those are kept there. Work papers for calculations, data entry, the screenshot of GRS entries. So if you have all your work papers and it was supposed to be $100,000, but we entered $10,000 and now we're getting a big red flag, we can say, oh, all that was a key punch error. Here's my work paper. Let's go fix it. And then any reports that are pushed out to someone else, so you know what they were given. And again, if there's a key punch error, you can go back and it's so simple to find. And if it's all in one place, and then the narrative. And so this is just, it doesn't have to be done every month, but the narrative includes, hey, back in our original tool, that flowchart, what are those reports that, and how do they work? Do we get 2 reports from program, or do we get 1 that we use? Do we get something from this manager and something else from that manager? And do we use them in different ways? And so just a narrative, how all of this stuff kind of flows together, so that in the event of a retirement and somebody else taking over, when you go through that training process or no training process, that this would be there so you could kind of follow through it. And again, it's just a best practice suggestion that we would have it all together and easy to find. And so when those needs arise, we're not looking through 8 folders or 6 desktops or anything else. And Bethany and I have gone through it all, with changes and people and processes. And once something's old, maybe not including it anymore. Like, we don't use this. So then we don't have 50 worksheets or workbooks included in our monthly stuff that we're not even updating anymore. So then we only have current items. So that's where this tool came into play. And again, we haven't really put anything in it except a list to say, hey, check these off and see what makes sense.
Yeah. Thanks, Kim.
Yep.
Yeah. It's just a simple list. And, we encourage you to look in your local area about maybe listing the specific file names and listing the specific file locations. And that's part of the narrative Kim talked about, is what on a monthly basis are you pulling from in order to get that GRS report done. So that is the conclusion of the toolkit. We are happy to answer any other questions. We know typically with this type of webinar and these types of tools, you might not have feedback until you actually get your hands on them and start to apply them. And we know that that takes time. We know it's hard to take away from the daily grind and to try something new, or another report that when you already have 10 reports on your desk. But we do encourage you to please try them out. Please keep this conversation going. Please give us input about what you think is most helpful for you, current staff, or maybe if you're preparing for some kind of transition in your team. So that is the end of our toolkit. We're happy to answer any other questions you have right now. And then we will close with John and Tamika.
And Bethany, this is Kim. There's no other chat questions currently. I know in one of our focus groups, some people said they prepare GRS more often than once a month. And so you could use these things as often or as infrequently as you needed to.
Thank you. Is there any input that anyone would like to offer about what we should consider for the next version or next tool? Okay, I don't see anyone typing, but we're going to welcome that input at any time. It doesn't just have to be today. So just so you know, you will get an invitation, as you always do, from Illinois WorkNet, asking you to take a survey. And when you are taking that survey, we really hope that you fill it out. We are going to learn from your responses. And some of the examples of questions that you'll be asked are, to what extent are you going to use this toolkit, either one or any of the individual tools? How easily do you think that they will be to customize to your local area? And then what other suggestions do you have for new tools that might be helpful to add as a practical tool in the toolkit? And Molly, thank you. She posted a copy of the survey in the chat box, and it'll also be available as the follow-up to this webinar. And then the last thing I would mention, just from our point of view, is that these are not yet saved on illinoisworknet.com/GATA, but they will be, and they will be shortly. So you're welcome to go test them out at any time. And John and Tamika, I'm going to ask there if you have anything else to add to today's presentation or for future thought.
Thank you, Bethany. And I just hand it to Tamika. Appreciate the presentation. Tamika, any final thoughts?
Yes, first, I just want to thank everyone that has been involved throughout this process and getting us to be able to present this toolkit to everyone. I just want to reiterate that the feedback, as Bethany has mentioned earlier, is very important. It was very instrumental with working with LWIA 10 and then working with our focus group. Those added comments and suggestions allowed us to make the needed adjustments that we've made along the way in preparation for this webinar. So again, I know it may take some time to get your hands on the templates and be able to utilize them. So whether it's tomorrow, next week, next month, that you're able to spend some time with the various templates, please do so, and please keep that feedback coming. It's very instrumental in this process. And again, thank you to Bethany, Mitch, and Kim for your part in this as well. It's definitely appreciated.
Thank you. So I think that concludes today's webinar, and we look forward to the ongoing conversation. Have a great weekend, everyone. Molly, is there anything else?
Nope, that concludes the webinar. We're really grateful for our presenters and for everyone who attended. And like Bethany mentioned, you'll get a survey via email from us, and it's also in the chat box. So if you want to do that right now while it's fresh, you can do that too. Alrighty, everyone, have a great rest of your day.